We're all here to try and make sense of the news of Trump's tariffs, their impact around the world and in the UK, and especially as we face the sort of spectre of a new US-UK trade agreement being negotiated at the moment. I won't give you much preamble as we're going to get the full download and all your questions answered by Ruth Bergan, who's the head of policy and advocacy at Transform Trade, and Nick Dearden, who's the director of Global Justice Now. We'll hear from each of these speakers, and then we can spend a good chunk of time on a Q&A. At the bottom of your Zoom window, you should see a button on the toolbar saying Q&A, where you can send your questions in directly. You should be able to see each other's questions, and then you can send them as you like throughout the event. I'll be able to gather them and put them to the speakers when we get to that section. If you have difficulty finding that, just pop them in the webinar chat, and I'll try and spot them in there as well. So, without further ado, maybe let's first hear from Nick Dearden from Global Justice Now, about sort of what the meaning is of these tariffs. Obviously, it's very fast evolving in the news cycle at the moment, so we're all trying to keep on top of it. What Trump's trying to do with them, and also this emergency trade deal that the UK government's trying to secure in response, in particular its digital and big tech dangers. So Nick, about 15 minutes from you, if that's okay.
Thanks very much, Claudia, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We've just been rather alarmed that in the half hour before we started this webinar, Trump has decided to pause for 90 days all tariffs above 10% for everyone but China. So we're trying to work out exactly what that means as we're going along. But I think the argument stands, and if anything, I would say probably what it represents more than anything is that Trump has blinked first in the light of some of the chaos that these economic policies have caused. But I think what I want to argue tonight is that this isn't simply incoherent and irrational, and there is some plan behind this, and to try and spell out what that might look like. First of all, important to say, I think, and I'm sure Ruth would agree, that tariffs are not necessarily the work of the devil. Tariffs can serve a useful purpose, and the idea that we've had rammed down our throats for the last 40 or 50 years, that tariffs are always and everywhere wrong, is nonsense, and actually quite hypocritical when it comes from countries who are levying their own tariffs. They can be done right, a good way to nurture industry, and to some degree to protect industry too. But Trump's tariffs, as announced 2 weeks ago, are something else entirely. He does say that he wants to resuscitate American manufacturing. And indeed, anyone who saw his speech where he launched the tariffs will notice that he had some trade unionists and industrial workers standing alongside him. So he says he wants to do that, but I think really, if that's genuinely what he wanted to do, he would have done this in a very, very different way. I think to protect and resuscitate American manufacturing, you would have seen far more focus on specific sectors. There's been some focus, but nowhere near as targeted as you'd expect. And there'd be a whole range of other measures as well, because tariffs without requirements that additional gains are reinvested by manufacturers is simply a way to allow those producers to effectively make more profits. So let's see. But I think that's the bit of this picture that I would take with the largest pinch of salt, probably. Probably people have already looked at this. The way that he has calculated these tariffs is particularly crazy. I mean, kind of looks like it was put into ChatGPT or something as an exercise. I mean, we know that Trump doesn't like the idea of having a trade imbalance, and there may be some legitimacy to his concern about the scale of the US trade deficit. But nonetheless, seeing incredibly high tariffs levied on Lesotho or the Falkland Islands is ridiculous, because the only reason for those tariffs is that those countries or island, in the case of the Falklands, import one thing essentially, and nothing in the world is going to allow those countries to buy enough of America's goods to get the reduction that he says they can get. So there is absolutely a whole host of misunderstanding about the way these things work on the part of Trump. But nonetheless, as I say, I do think we should be careful about thinking this is just the kind of whims of a madman, because there are some clever people around Trump. And for all of its contradictions, I think this does play into a kind of grand plan. And I think that falls into two parts in terms of what he's really trying to do. And we should say as well, I mean, this is the one part of Trump's agenda that he really believes in. So since way back in the late 80s, I think, he's talked about tariffs and how much he loves tariffs. So this is something that he's fairly consistent about. And he bases a lot of that on his understanding of American history, going back to the Gilded Age, what was called the Gilded Age of the United States in the late 19th century, a time when a small handful of financiers and industrialists grew fabulously wealthy by monopolizing new technologies and the economy in general, which sounds quite familiar, and inequality was absolutely rife. He thinks that was the golden age of American history, and he attributes a large part of that to tariffs. And in the same way, domestically, we know, because he's been perfectly honest about this, that he wants to use tariffs as a giant tax giveaway that will be felt mostly by the very richest. So in his first term, he did a huge package of tax cuts, mostly falling on the very richest in terms of who benefited. That's coming up for review. And he absolutely wants to continue that because he thinks it's one of the main achievements of his first term. But he doesn't have the money to pay for it. And everybody probably knows here that US debt is extremely high, and he has promised not to reduce spending in certain areas. So there's bits we know Elon Musk is doing with Doge, but very unlikely that those cost savings are going to be anything like the level required for the tax cuts that he wants to give. So the tariffs, he believes, will bring in enough income to maintain those tax cuts. And ultimately, he talks about the abolition of income tax, right? So that idea of redistribution from ordinary Americans to the richest are going to be right at the center of that. And of course, what he's hoping to convince Americans is you won't be paying for this, foreigners will be paying for it, because that's how he thinks tariffs work. And it is true, of course, it does make life more difficult for anybody who wants to export from abroad. So there is an extent to which the cost will fall on foreigners, but a huge amount of the cost is going to fall on ordinary Americans in the inflation that we're going to see in coming weeks. So that's the domestic part of the puzzle. But I think he has broader and bigger international goals as well. From what I can see, Trump is trying to reorder the world economy in a way that benefits the United States for the period that we're in. This is really the first time, say the last 10 years, since the 1980s, that US supremacy has been challenged in the world. And I think Trump wants to use tariffs, and he's potentially going to use more tools too, I should say, including a possible debt default, an enormous debt default that has been floated, to try and shift the dial and force other countries to pay more for continued US dominance in the world. You can also see it with the security guarantees he's been talking about over Ukraine and so on. And just to explain this a bit more, probably important to understand the globalization project that began in the late 80s, early 90s, because much of Trump's program takes aim at this globalization program that I am also a critique of. But I don't think globalization was the fault of China. Indeed, Trump admits that to some extent. It was the fault of US elites, and it was built on this idea that America didn't really need to make anything anymore. It could import all the stuff that it needed that could be made much cheaper elsewhere. And so a range of developing countries were told to run export economy, so they would be making stuff essentially for the US. That hollowed out US manufacturing and created the Rust Belt and left behind bits of the United States, but that wasn't a big problem for those in charge of the globalization project, because that weakened labor within the United States too. And meanwhile, the US prioritized those sectors of the economy that were higher value. So finance, services, increasingly as information technology, as technologies developed, and it put in place rules to ensure that it could extract as much as possible out of those sectors of the economy. They were as well protected as they possibly could be. So those of you who followed the work that we did on Big Pharma during COVID and so on will know about IP rules that were brought in, intellectual property rules that were brought in the 90s, all about ensuring that that America maintained dominance in those sectors of the economy that were really high value. And so that seemed like a good deal for American elites until 10 years ago or so, when it was pretty clear that China had entered the globalization project under Clinton, and in some ways beat the US at its own game. Didn't simply stick to doing what they were supposed to do and manufacturing cheap goods, but actually began to invest huge amounts in technology and in research, and to rival the United States in a way that no other country has done since the Second World War. So all to say, we're moving to a multipolar world rapidly. The United States is heavily in debt, partly as a result of the way this globalized project works. It's deeply unequal. It doesn't have the manufacturing capacity that Trump thinks is necessary in the highly militarized world of great power confrontation that we're moving into. So this tariff policy is about changing that. And he knows it's going to cause pain along the way. And perhaps what we've discovered tonight is slightly too much pain too quickly. But essentially, that's been factored in. But what he wants to do is to shift the terms on which he's trading with other nations and force other nations to give all manner of different concessions that would essentially shift the terms of trade. I should say, this is not to say that this new phase of globalization or world economy is not about corporate power. Lots of corporations have expressed how unhappy they are with some of the chaos in recent days, and I'm sure they are. Some of them are losing a lot of money, others will be gaining. But effectively, I still believe that corporate interests and financial interests are going to be right at the heart of the new world order that Trump tries to create. But he's moving towards what I would describe as more of a kind of fascist economy, frankly, an authoritarian capitalism where corporations and state interests are very, very closely aligned with each other. And I think you can see that in some of the way that the oligarchs have lined up, regardless of what their personal views and all sorts of social issues are, behind Trump before his election. So I think there is purpose here. I think it is about building an economy in which the US asserts power for itself and the interests of its elites. But I also think it's true and important to remember when we're thinking of strategies out of this, that Trump's tariffs are in some ways also a sign of weakness, therefore, not just of strength, right? He's bullying and he's using the strengths he's got, but at the same time, he wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't for the fact that American power and hegemony is challenged in this way. And I know I've been talking for a while already. Let me very quickly move on to what the UK is doing in this situation. So, I mean, Starmer has been bowing and scraping to try to get out of the tariffs. He didn't manage to do that. The 10% levy that was raised on us was the same for all manner of countries that haven't behaved in the same way. The formula was applied to us. But he is in trade negotiations, trade talks now with the United States administration aimed at removing the 10% of tariffs that we've been lumbered with. And our concern is that in order to get around those tariffs, in order to get a loophole from those tariffs, he's going to have to give away some really important stuff. And we do not think in any way at all that is worth the price that we will be paying for it. We know the kind of stuff that Trump wants out of countries like the UK, because it is in a very long document, a 400-page document called the National Trade Estimates Report on Foreign Trade Barriers. And he is very clear in there, there are all manner of public health regulations, renewable energy incentives, deforestation, supply chain regulations, and particularly for the UK, it's very clear, food standards. We've campaigned before on chlorine chicken, many of you will remember, but it is a permanent bugbear of the United States that we do not allow food made to very different standards into UK markets. And they see this as absolutely on the table, whatever the UK government says. But what we do know the UK government is going to go along with is all manner of changes to digital, AI, and high-tech regulation. And that is just as scary, even though it might not be quite as revolting as the idea of those poor chlorine-washed chickens. But it is really important. They've already said very clearly they want the UK to scrap the digital services tax, which allows the UK to recoup some of the income, which those notorious tax dodgers in the big tech world avoid every year. So they want us to scrap that, but they also want a whole range of other things, which big tech's been banging on about for years. This really, they've learned from what the pharmaceutical industry did in the mid-90s, where it embedded its interests into trade rules, international trade rules, and forced countries all over the world to abide by as a set of protections that guaranteed them monopolies in perpetuity. And that's what big tech's trying to do now. And so you've got all manner of things in there, like hands-off AI regulation, not holding the people that are inventing this stuff liable for any harms they cause, tearing up some of the online safety regulation, preventing regulators from seeing the source code and the algorithms that are really the stuff under the bonnet that makes new technologies work. That could be disastrous if you think of all of the decisions that are going to be increasingly made by AI, life and death decisions in public services. And regulators can't actually understand how those decisions are being made or check for biases or whatever. Allowing our personal data to flow freely into the United States, even as data protection is being dismantled by Trump there, which would allow the companies that own that data to use it and manipulate it in all kinds of ways that aren't allowed here at the moment, and making it much more difficult to challenge the anti-competitive behavior of these companies. And we know these companies are absolute past masters at locking us into their brands, not allowing us to repair products that we own, creating their own silly plugs that mean that you can't, they're not interoperable with other tech products. The way Amazon treats its suppliers online, this is coming in for increasing pushback across Europe. A trade deal would make all of that stuff much harder. It would have rules that guaranteed the rights of those multinational corporations in there. So it's a really bad idea. We are now campaigning to stop this trade deal and to say it is absolutely not worth doing this deal at this time. But more generally, and I'll finish on this, more generally, I think countries like the UK have to be prepared to work with other countries to stand up against Trump's bullying, because Trump is a bully more than anything else. We all know that. And if you give him an inch, he will take a mile. He will continue coming back for more and more and more. I think what we've got to do is use this moment to work in coordination with other countries to begin changing the way the global economy works, not in favor of the United States, but in favor of the kind of fairer planet that we want to build. And I think it is possible, if you look at the stuff that European countries are discussing at the moment in terms of the retaliation they might offer. It isn't necessarily just reciprocal tariffs. It's stuff around data flows from the US into Europe. It's stuff around the terms on which financial corporations can come over and set up in Europe. It's whether we abide by a US-style intellectual property on products coming into Europe. Really, really big stuff. And I think we've got to join with that and stand up against this bullying. I think that's the primary way we're going to defeat Trumpism. And I've got numerous Americans who I've been talking to over here and in the States who are saying, for God's sake, don't give in to this guy. You've got to stand up to him. That's our only chance of defeating this project. So we've got to do it for that reason. But for goodness sake, I mean, Ruth and I have been campaigning on trade for many, many, many years now. The way the international trade system works is not good at all, and in some ways has created this situation we're in now. So let's use this opportunity to change it for the better. Thank you. Sorry, I went over there, Claudia.
That's fine. That was great. Thank you. Just a reminder to people that you can use the Q&A function to send in your questions that we'll come to a bit later. So now I'll bring in Ruth Bergan from Transform Trade, who I think will be covering the kind of punitive impact of Trump's tariffs on countries around the world, particularly in the global south, and some of the other aspects of the potential US-UK deal. So Ruth, about 15 minutes, if that's okay.
Thanks. I'm going to try and share my screen. Bear with me a second. This is not my forte. The share bit isn't letting me. Okay, window, yes, share. Maybe it's not going to work. Let's see whether that works. No. Okay, I'm going to forget that. It's a shame. There were some really nice slides that I was going to share with you.
Do you have the green share screen button?
I have a different color. Yes, yeah, that's what I've clicked on. And entire screen, it will not let me share. Window, it looks like it wants to, but when I click on it, nothing happens. So I'm not sure. Yeah,
I'm not sure about that.
I'll just get on with it because we don't want to waste people's time. So anyway, thanks very much to Global Justice Now for having me, and to everyone who's come. It's really great to have such a lot of people coming to this session because it's just such an important issue. Nick's run through what just happened part of this, but I just want to reiterate a couple of things. I did write this at 3 p.m, which in today's world is ages ago. So as Nick says, there's now this 90-day pause. So some of what I'm going to say is out of date. But I think since it's a 90-day pause, I'm going to say in 90 days, this could be the world we're in. Let's see. So we have still 10% tariffs across the board. That's all countries and all products. And that's the minimum that anyone is going to get charged. Lots of countries until about 3 o'clock today were going to be hit with much higher tariffs. There are no exemptions. So from a global south point of view, that's huge. Nobody's exempt from these tariffs. There's nothing that says, we'll stick with our previous promises and provide some sort of differential position for developing countries. It is the biggest upheaval of the trade system in about 100 years. And you may have read people talking about the Smoot-Hawley Act, which brought in huge tariffs on about 20,000 products. I'm sure there are many, many more than that these days, but on 20,000 products in the 1930s, and caused the Great Depression in the US to be much worse than it needed to be. So that's the sort of precedent that we're talking about. And of course, we're now in a much more globalized world, so the impacts are going to be even worse, and for the global south, particularly bad. So I'm just going to, this would have been a whole lot easier with some slides, because I'm going to talk through loads of numbers, and it would have been great to have that in front of you. So my next slide is a quote which kind of sets out how the US used to do things until the 6th of April, which is to say they had something called the Generalized System of Preferences, which provided opportunities for many of the world's poorest countries. This is a quote from the Office of the United States Trade Representative. So to provide opportunities for many of the world's poorest countries to use trade to grow their economies and climb out of poverty. So there was that idea, that recognition that trade could be a way to help countries whose economies were not as strong as the US's. And the UK and the EU have similar provisions. So we have a thing called Everything But Arms, where we give 0 tariffs to countries for everything but arms below a certain level of development, and then graduated tariffs for countries at different levels of development. So on the 6th of April, Trump just got rid of all of that with no exemptions. And as Nick said, some of the most eye-watering tariffs were for some of the world's poorest countries, like Lesotho. My next slide is a lovely map to show just how widespread the tariffs were. And the darker the red, the worse you were hit by the tariffs. So moving on swiftly then, we were looking at which countries were particularly badly hit by this, to try and draw out what some of the impacts were going to be. From our point of view at Transform Trade, we work very closely with partners in Bangladesh, India, Kenya and Tanzania. So we've been looking quite hard at them. Bangladesh hit by a 37% tariff, up from 15%. So that's huge for them, and they're massively reliant on garments exports, including to the US, but also EU and UK. India, 26%, and I'll come back to why that difference matters. And then Kenya and Tanzania at 10%, so alongside the UK. And actually what's interesting is you can see that the tariffs are going to be high for countries in the global south, but actually there will be differences in impact. So for example, for Tanzania, whilst the 10% increase could be a lot if they were starting on zero, which they would have been under the preferential arrangements that Trump just got rid of. So a 10% increase on their products is going to feel like a big jump, but only 2% of their exports actually go to the US. So they may be relatively cushioned from the impacts, but that's not the case for all countries. Some of them will be really badly hit. And on my slide, I have a list of garments exporters. So you have Cambodia with a 49% tariff. Who knows what Cambodia has done to Trump, but obviously he wasn't happy about it. 49% tariff, and 40% of their trade. So nearly half of their trade goes to the US. So that's crippling to them. There's not a lot they can do about that. As Nick said, Lesotho, 50%. So some of the world's poorest countries and those who've been recently facing environmental disasters, conflict. So you have Syria at 41, Myanmar at 45, Laos at 48. I mean, it's just excruciating to read, right? This sort of disregard for the status of different countries and for the economic pain they're already feeling because of all of these different impacts. So that's something that I've just been sort of reeling from for the past few days. So garment exporters particularly badly hit, and what's interesting is that you have Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Cambodia all between 30 and 50%, and then you have India at 26%. And why that matters is that India is also a big garment exporter, and also a bit better endowed in terms of infrastructure. So what we think will happen if this all comes back into place is you'll see a diversion of trade away from countries like Bangladesh. And for Bangladesh and Cambodia, that's a disaster again, because they're so dependent on a small handful of industries that, and it's very, very easy for these supply chains to shift. The manufacturing looks very similar. They're all capable of making basic T-shirts, jeans, embroidered stuff. They're all set up to do that. So there's very little to stop those supply chains from shifting fairly quickly. Some other kind of supply chains would move less easily because the types of manufacturing you're talking about is harder to set up a new factory for cars than it maybe is for sort of stitching T-shirts, especially if you've already got a track record there. So I then just wanted to talk really quickly about how we've been responding so far. So in common with Global Justice Now, we've put a hand raiser up for our supporters. And that's just a way for our supporters to be able to say, we don't agree with this. We want to stand in solidarity with those countries against these tariffs. And just a kind of show of strength and a show of solidarity. It won't do much more than that in the first instance, but we are hoping to build on it. We've been able to get a little bit of media coverage, so The Guardian and BBC and a few others, which is great because we think it's an issue that might not get much attention if we don't try. And we're already trying to get some parliamentary questions down because we think there are a few things the UK can do to at least help. Obviously, it's not going to be able to quite match the scale of the impact, but there are some things that we think could be done to help. So just in terms of what I think we can do in the face of something so overwhelming, I think there are things. I think it won't be aid. So the UK has already cut aid. There's lots of talk about how difficult this is going to be for countries because US aid got cut so recently. But I think we have to understand that actually the action on tariffs is much more serious than aid. I don't want to undermine the sort of usefulness of aid. It was doing good things. But for example, Bangladesh, its exports to the US were worth $8.6 billion. At its height, they were getting $400 million of aid from the US. So you can see the difference in impact right there. And I think that's something that I would really like sort of us as a movement, other NGOs, CSOs, to be really thinking about is, are we ready to respond when this kind of stuff happens? Are we taking seriously enough the impact of trade? And I think, we've got trade in our name, so we have to. Global Justice Now has a really good track record of working on trade. So I would say we are, but I think there's definitely room for persuading others that they need to look at this issue a lot more closely. So aid is not it. We have campaigned again alongside Global Justice Now for a long time for a business human rights and environment act. I think so. So all of the things that I'm about to say are about the UK sorting out its own act, right? We've spent too long wringing our hands about how terrible conditions are in supply chains, and then just sort of going, well, there's that voluntary standard over there. That'll do, there's a bit of fair trade. That's great. We are born of the fair trade movement. I like fair trade, but it's not enough. So we want a Business Human Rights and Environment Act, and that it just means that companies will no longer be allowed to drive human rights abuses in their supply chains and will be held to account for it. And most importantly, workers at the end of the supply chain will have some means of redress, at least if we design the act well. That's the next challenge. But we think that's crucial now, because the pressure down the supply chain as a result of tariffs will be huge. What we see happening over and over is that when a crisis happens, businesses will squeeze wages, cut corners on health and safety, sack people overnight. We saw this during the COVID-19 pandemic. UK brands cancelled their orders, sometimes after the orders had been shipped. So the factory has sent the products over to the UK, and somewhere, when the ship is somewhere in the ocean, the brand decides it's not going to pay for the products. So we predict that that's what will happen, and a Business and Human Rights Act could help with that, as could something that we're calling a fashion watchdog. So I think it's particularly noticeable. We think this is particularly relevant given the impacts on garment exporting countries. But a fashion watchdog would just say to UK brands, look, you will pay on time. You will pay the amount you said you would, and you're not going to add unforeseen costs to this, because that's what happens as well. They'll decide that, well, if you want to have your T-shirt at the front of the shop, you're going to have to pay a little bit more. If you don't want your product up at the top shelves in Tesco, that's going to cost you more as well. A fashion watchdog should get rid of all of that. It doesn't do everything that we'd like to see in supply chains, and that's why a Business and Human Rights Act is important, because that does some of the other things. But we think a fashion watchdog is a step the UK can take that would really help. And the last thing is, so myself and Nick and others in the sector are all looking at the UK's development of a trade strategy. We're very glad they're doing it. We're a bit worried about what they're actually going to say in it, because it's likely to be all about how we're going to be a big tech leader, which is, I think, in the trade strategies of probably every other country that thinks it's got some sort of chance of doing that. So what we'd really like to see is a trade strategy that sort of does some of what Nick was just saying and thinks about, how can the UK show that there's a way to be a good global player? So in contrast to Trump, can we set our stall out as a good cooperative actor in the world, in the trade space? That's what I would really like to see from Labour. And I think, we can give them a bit of credit for what they did on debt and aid back under Blair and Brown, whatever else we think about them. They were willing to do that. They saw the value of acting as a good global player in some spaces. And I think there is a world in which they rediscover that. I'm not sure it's the world that we're currently in, but we are trying to make that case. And for me, it would be a trade strategy that really puts people and planet, as we've said for years, puts that at the heart and says, trade's just a means to an end. It's nothing else. It's just a tool for getting stuff that we want. So what are the things we want, and how do we make UK trade look like something that seriously helps us to get there and doesn't just, as Nick said, benefit bigger businesses, the most powerful. How do we make sure, now, how do we stop assuming that just because we make it easier for big tech, that will trickle down to everyone else? What can we put in place in this strategy that says climate comes first, labour rights and human rights come first, and trade is just one of the ways that we're going to help to get there, and we're going to make sure that nothing in the trade space is going to stop us from achieving those goals. Thanks, I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Ruth, and sorry about your slides, but we can make sure we get them off you and send them out to everyone who's joined, so they will be seen. So I'm going to try and put to Nick and Ruth some of your questions. Thanks for sending them in, and do put more in. I'll try and keep up with new ones coming in. There's some of them kind of relate to each other, so I'll try and group some together. There's a couple of quite practical basic ones about how do tariffs actually work in practice, and do these are these sort of duties only for industrial traders or the average Etsy seller? Someone's wanting clarification about that, and also what actually happens to the money raised by these tariffs. So I hope you guys have pens and paper, because I'm going to put a few to you. Another aspect of the tariffs, and I think this is a really interesting one, someone asking, is there potentially an upside to stopping globalization? People mentioning this can help with reducing climate emissions from shipping and stopping the madness of capitalism. And I think there's really interesting points there, because something I want to add on to that is, what does it kind of mean for us as trade justice campaigners when we're seeing some of our lines about kind of globalization and this kind of this notion of free trade, but it's kind of coming out of the wrong mouths or for the wrong purposes? And so how do we kind of deal with that as trade justice campaigners, and how do we tease out the kind of bad intentions there? And slightly building on that, I guess we've gone into a bit of the kind of what's Trump's actual plan behind these tariffs, but people are also asking about what's the long-term nature of the potential gains for the US for this tariffs policy. And I think this is speaking to, can they actually rebuild manufacturing in the US? And just to relate this to someone else's question, is that actually the plan? Are the poorer or just less rich US citizens part of the equation or part of the thinking here? So those are a few. They're quite broad ranging, but maybe each of you could speak to different parts of that, and then I'll come back to some other questions. I'll let you choose between you who'd like to go first.
Do you know how tariffs work, Ruth? Can I give you that one?
Oh, I knew you'd do that. Do I know how tariffs work? So, like, at its most basic, they're just a tax that's charged at the border. And in theory, it's paid for by the importer. So when you hear people saying, well, it's the US that's going to pay for it, that's why. It's because the importer has to pay the tax. They pay it at the border. But in practice, what the importer will do is say, well, if this is going to cost me 50 quid more, I'm going to pay you 50 quid less, 25 quid less. So that's why it could be a problem, not just for the US, but for other countries as well. I don't know whether there's much. So there's tariffs. There are import taxes and export taxes and other kinds of that. Is one of the reasons why this is so silly is that there are so many different kinds of tax that he could have used, let alone all of the other levers he could have used if he wanted to. What happens to the cash? The cash just goes into government coffers, unless it's something like, so there is a possibility with some kinds of border taxes to funnel it into a specific pot, but that's what I'm thinking of is like a carbon border tax. So where you charge a tax at the border for higher emitting products, and you can then decide you want to allocate that to something specific, like, environmental projects or something. But I don't think that. I think he just wants the cash in his pocket, as Nick was saying, to substitute for the tax cuts that he wants to make. So he's trying to kind of reduce taxes on his wealthy friends and raise it on everyone else. The just without taking into account the fact that actually the importer has to pay the tax. But I guess the only thing I can imagine is he's thinking, well, they'll just knock that to other countries.
And the 10% across the board, then, I mean, it's still going to be a huge revenue raiser, right? I mean, that does justify the fact that he's and it does seem like they're saying he will pause for 90 days those who have approached him already. Because, last night he said, I've got all these countries kissing my ass, and literally said that, and, desperate to give me everything that they've got. So 90 days in which those negotiations happen, sounds like.
But one of the things I didn't say is, again, I don't imagine Lesotho were the first on the plane or the first through the door. So it's, he's talked about Japan, he was talking about a couple of other countries, but countries in the global south they don't have that capacity, to go and knock on his door.
What can they give?
And also they're not of that much interest to him.
Yeah.
Clearly.
What can they give?
Yeah. I was going to say one of the things that Bangladesh has said is that they want to buy more US cotton. And it's just how ridiculous this is. How are they going to afford that? Number one. And number two, they buy cotton from West Africa. So the West African countries who are highly dependent on cotton, Brazil and India. So then you have West African cotton producers paying for Bangladesh's trade deficit with the US, which is a deficit caused by the fact that they're a poorer country than the US. Anyway, sorry, didn't answer the question about Etsy sellers. I don't really know about Etsy. I guess you have to pay an import tax, but sometimes very small amounts are exempt depending on where you are.
So that's exactly what happens, Ruth, because we were looking into this, and this is where the de minimis thing comes in that he's been talking about, right? Which is important for the Chinese fashion seller that I can never pronounce the name of. Shein. I always get it wrong. Shein, that is important for them because they sell stuff in such tiny quantities. So, and he was talking about reducing that amount to nothing, I think, something like that. And so that would be, which is not necessarily a problem for us, right? I mean, that's the kind of fast fashion that, yes, it is a real problem. And I guess that goes to the question about the potential upside. Yes, I think the global trade system we have encourages completely unsustainable consumption models. So we know that, and we've been arguing against that for a long time. I think the problem is to unravel that system is not easy, and it's got to surely be done in a way which doesn't completely screw those countries who were told this is the way that you will develop, this is the way you will grow. I mean, the US, the IMF, the European Union, the World Bank, for years told countries they've got to do this. I mean, even worse, actually, they told lots of countries, you've all got to start growing and producing the same thing, which drove prices down, which is one of the reasons that this stuff is so cheap. And that's been, some benefit for consumers in the West, but it's been a huge benefit for the corporations that manage those supply chains. So to punish those countries and the workers, who are obviously the ones that are going to bear the brunt of it in those countries, is just horrific. But I think that the question is right in that I think we need to be careful not just to say, let's go back to the way things were. I think we've got to use this opportunity to say we need a radically different form of global economy. And as a way of getting there, as Ruth says, we surely have a duty to help some of those countries and workers who are going to feel immense pain as a result of this. And that is going to be quite a balance. And I do think our voices are going to be important there. One of the things that's been talked about is the diversion of goods that were going to the US to the UK, which will mean we may be getting cheaper goods for a while, right? Because they'll be diverted here. And the government is now scrabbling for ways to redress that and to keep out goods that are surging into our market effectively. And of course, to some extent, you understand why they're going to do that. But at the same time, they need to work out a fair system by which that is done. And then I think the long-term nature of the gains for the US is a really interesting question. So I mean, I think there probably will be some manufacturing gains here and there, but I don't think it's going to be anything like the reindustrialization of the United States. That's not what I think the gain is going to be. But the gains will be that United States corporations and investors end up with an even greater hold on important supply chains than they've got now, and potentially a reduced debt. And that's the other side of it. One of the ways that the global economy works really problematically is countries are able to build up enormous surpluses and deficits, both on the trade side of real stuff and on the capital side. And the US, is the biggest importer in the world, I guess, but also, it pays for that basically through kind of exporting capital. I mean, people invest in the US and they want the dollars and so on. And this is a problem. This is a problem for Trump because it's one of the things that's caused this. The dollar is high, and that means that they can't actually rebuild manufacturing capacity, and it's also created a kind of a debt spiral. So there is this plan that I spoke about called the Mar-a-Lago Accord, which has been floated by a senior Trump official, which posits their way out of this will be to essentially default on that debt, to offer holders of that debt a vastly reduced amount over a very long period of time. So effectively, for any other country or company, that would be called a default. That would be an immense rewiring of the global financial system, because the dollar is the kind of safe. It's like buying gold at the moment, essentially. So the question, and that would really be like tariffs, but on steroids, an attempt to push the pain of this readjustment onto every other country in the world. And the question then is, does every other country in the world just meekly accept that? Or are they going to fight back at that point? But again, I think if you take those two things in combination, potential changes to the financial structure with potential changes to the trade system, you really begin to see just how big a reordering of the world economy this is. And people on podcasts I've been listening to and so on have compared this to the Nixon shock in the early 1970s, where effectively the Bretton Woods system was dismantled and finance was liberalized, that gave rise to neoliberalism and gave rise to globalization and these large imbalances. So, potentially what we're looking at here is really, really, really big. And I think, we have to be prepared to not say, let's just revert to the status quo ante, but to really say, we need a very, very different international economy that we've been calling for a long time, which is not dominated by these gigantic corporations and financial interests.
Thank you. Ruth, shout if you want to add anything, or I'll throw some more questions in the mix.
Let's have some more questions.
Okay.
As many people involved as possible.
Cool. So there are a few questions about this devaluing the dollar thing, which I think Nick has just addressed, so that's great. Something else someone has raised, which I think is also interesting, because it's kind of part of this. Basically, what is the role of the World Trade Organization in all this, in ensuring compliance with their rules for free trade? And I guess again, it's when we're finding this has also been a common foe for us as well as free trade campaigners, and it feels like there's not a kind of two sides anymore in this game, and there's a lot of kind of misunderstanding about where one's natural allies are. So I don't know if either of you have any thoughts about the WTO. On top of that, or Ruth, do you want to come in on that just now while it's fresh in mind?
No, we could take a few, and then
cool.
Me and Nick have got different stuff to talk about, maybe.
All good. Someone else there's a lot of a fair amount of shade on Keir Starmer in the chat. I think that's fair. so people are asking, like, how do we deal with someone like Starmer being the person who is responding to this, and what can the average person do to stop Starmer or the UK in general entering this proposed trade agreement with the US, and also what can we do in the UK to mobilize around potential state visits from Trump and things like that. So a bit more speaking to the what we can do on our like public campaigning side. And then just finally, on the more international level, and you guys have spoken to this a little bit, but to what extent is it possible, or in what sort of ways could countries stand together against the Trump tariffs, and what kind of potential is there? Just briefly, someone put a request for links about distinguishing between good or bad or useful or not useful tariffs, and I'm just going to pop in the chat an article done by one of our US colleagues about why the Trump tariffs are done, but not for the reasons you think, because I think that's a really helpful resource on that. But yeah, take it away, Nick or Ruth, or Nick.
Shall I try and say something about the WTO? So there are many reasons to not like the WTO, and I think if you've been following Global Justice Now's work for a few years, you'll know about that. But in summary, when it was set up in 94, 95, it had recognised disadvantages for the Global South, and that was acknowledged. So then you were supposed to have a round for development in 2001, which actually never really concluded and never agreed anything much. And so what you have is big business effectively setting the agenda and getting exactly what it wanted, and the Global South missing out massively. And you still see that today. There are still issues around unfair subsidies. So not so long ago, the US got taken to the WTO by Brazil for unfair subsidies on cotton. Brazil won. The US just subsidized Brazilian cotton as well. And it just kind of gives you a flavor of just how unfair the WTO can be. So I'm no fan of the WTO. The problem for us is the absence of any multilateral system is probably even worse for countries with the least ability to negotiate, bargain. There is a sense in which at the WTO there can be groupings of countries and they can advocate the things that they want. And it's been particularly useful as India and South Africa have grown in power. They have got behind some useful things on behalf of the broader groupings of developing countries. And one of the things that they have really stuck by, and it's been problematic in some ways, is the ability to self-define as a developing country. So not to have the US telling you what status you should have in that forum. The problem being that China has kind of hidden behind that and completely refused to budge from it. But it's more than just them digging their heels in. It's about the right to self-definition. And also that, they're using it as a bargaining chip. If they were to give up on that without getting some concessions from industrialized countries, that would be a mistake, and they've recognized that. And so you often hear people say, well, China are a problem, but actually, yes, they're not playing entirely fair, but they know why, and they're sort of using the WTO system. So the problem is that I think we need something else. So as Nick's saying, what we need is an alternative we can go to rather than just the dismantling of the multilateral system, I think, because I don't think it works very well for countries in the Global South. And our friends, La Via Campesina, I'm not quite sure what stage they're at with this, but they have a proposal to set up a completely different agreement for food and agriculture outside of the WTO. So one of the most problematic parts of the WTO is the agreement on agriculture. Just an absolute car crash of an agreement. Nobody really understood how the formulas were going to work. And because, again, countries in the Global South just did not have the capacity to understand the system, work out what everyone else had done. They just found themselves really disadvantaged by it. And so the LVC, La Via Campesina, are saying, well, let's set up something different. And they were telling me last time I saw them that they've had a kind of warm reception to that from countries like China. So I think that's the direction of travel. What's the role of the WTO in ensuring compliance? Well, guess what? The UK pulled out of the dispute settlement mechanism. So that doesn't exist anymore. So periodically we hear things like China are going to take the US to the WTO. but there's no panel to adjudicate. So it will be a minor embarrassment that I think Trump will shrug off. But beyond that, the WTO only really has teeth if you're a less powerful country. The world's most powerful countries have always just overridden it. You know, the EU got fined for its rules on, I think it was hormone treated beef, and it just waved it away and said to the US, well, we'll import a bit more of your organic beef. Okay, so if you've got the money to do that kind of stuff, you just ignore the rules. And that's what would happen, I think, in this case. What to do about Starmer? I don't know. I'm going to leave Nick to talk about that. Is it possible to stand together? Well, I think I'm sure Nick has talked about this, and you probably all know more about this than I do, but there are proposals from, 80 years ago about a completely different way of running the economy, so new international economic order, and it's an oldie but a goodie. And I like, to me, that would be a very good starting point. It's still held by one of the UN trade bodies, UNCTAD. It doesn't do a whole lot, but I think that could be a reasonable starting point, and then you sort of look at it and think about what needs to be updated and modernized, and which countries would be willing to get behind it, because there are still countries who believe in that stuff. They just never get any airtime, and so it's really different. And the thing that was at the heart of that at the time was the goal of 100% employment. So trade was aimed at decent work, and that, to me, that's a really good starting point. And if we set alongside that the aim of trade is to support climate and environmental goals, surely that's a good starting point. So that's the sort of thing that I imagine, and they've done it before. So it's definitely not impossible, but very challenging. Anyway, I'll stop talking.
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, I think the China question is really interesting, isn't it? Because in a way, China just said, well, we're not going to remain in that position you've assigned us. We're going to develop in the way that you did. And it was successful, like very few other countries have been successful. You don't have to romanticize the Chinese government or anything like that. It was just clever what they did, and why wouldn't they? I wonder whether, because it's, I mean, we will of course campaign in solidarity with the Via Campesina around their system, their alternative model. But I think the likelihood of us convincing a British government anytime soon to play a constructive role in that is minimal. But I think that might actually not matter at this point in time, because you mentioned new international economic order, and we're very far away from the vision of that. But what we do have on our side is a bunch of global South countries rapidly rising up the income and global power scale. It's not just China. There's a whole bunch of countries that people know about behind them who again just aren't prepared to be treated in this way anymore. The case of critical minerals is a really interesting one, where countries like Indonesia are saying, oh, we're not just going to sell you these things on whatever terms you want. Like, we want them for our own industry so we can start making batteries. And we'll just sell you the raw metal cheap. And the EU is trying to challenge them, but it's, they can't put this back in the box, I think. Like, there's all manner of countries, including, really quite poor countries like Democratic Republic of Congo, are also taking actions to say, no, we want this for our own development. So I think this idea of South-South trade is something we've talked about for a long time, but I just hope that we will start to see that emerging more. And it's the one real piece of optimism I do bring from Trump, because clearly what he's about is trying to reverse the slow decline of American power in the world. And short term, I'm sure he will wrest some concessions out of these governments, but long term, he can't hold back the tide. And long term, I think we will actually look back on what he has done as potentially an acceleration of the decline of American power in the world and the move towards a multipolar world. And I just hope that comes without too much pain and conflict. But I do think that this is not the early 70s in terms of America, trying to regain its power in the world. And so, in that sense, there are opportunities here as well as threats. let me come to Starmer. So obviously, Starmer has done his very best to try and appease Trump. I think the really interesting thing is that is not popular. It's not popular among Labour voters, but it's not popular among any voters. There was an opinion poll out yesterday that showed the majority of people want retaliation of some sort. The overwhelming majority of people do not want to accept chlorine chicken. And so for me, I think what we've got to do is kind of break this media silence. Which there's a thing that the kind of political class of this country got, which is kind of like, well, Starmer seems probably right. You know, he played a blinder in the White House. Well, that only lasted for 2 days, but they've kind of, you know, maintained this line that this is the role we should take. It is not supported, from what I can see, by members of the public at all. I mean, the Guardian's been particularly bad at defending Starmer's line, and it was fascinating. There was a whole letters page in the Guardian a few days ago with people just saying, "No, we think you should stand up to the bully." So I think there's everything to play for there. I think people are deeply uncomfortable in general across the political spectrum about the way Starmer is clearly not standing up for people in this country, never mind people in the global south. And there is deep distrust of any kind of trade deal that we get with Donald Trump. And it's worth reminding people that we have been here twice before. The trade deal, the TTIP trade deal between the EU and the US, which we defeated, and then the Boris Johnson trade deal, which was defeated 5 years ago or so. Starmer, from what we've heard from the negotiations, they've picked up where they've left off on that deal. So I think there's everything to play for, and I think this is one issue where we really can convince people that this is a bad deal done with a completely unacceptable president who we know, for goodness sake, I mean, the whole point of these tariffs is he's ripping up every deal that America's ever signed anyway. So why on earth would he abide by the terms of any deal we sign with him now? So I think we can do this, actually. And I'd just like you to get involved in any way that you can in your local area. Just talk to people about it. Put letters in your local newspapers. Join up to the campaign online. And of course, I've got to say, while there's still a lot of people here, if you're not a member of Global Justice Now, please join Global Justice Now. There we are. James has put something in the chat box there, so you can easily link to it. But I think on this, and I mean, I don't know if people have seen in recent days, because of the threat to the Online Safety Act and some of the child protection stuff online, I mean, there's been numerous editorials written in various papers now from civil society folk saying it is not worth ripping up these rules for Donald Trump. I think we can build a really big coalition here. And if he comes to the UK, Stop Trump Coalition, which please go again to their website and sign up to their petition to stop the state visit, is going to mobilize an almighty number of people to welcome him here. And I think in some ways that will be quite good, actually, because it sends a really clear message to all people in the United States who are also suffering. There's awful stuff going on in the United States. Migrants just being, seized off the street, kidnapped essentially, and incarcerated. Horrendous. So I think, let's make sure we are ready to welcome him properly, as we did last time, and send that message of solidarity to people in the United States and all those who are suffering as a result of his policies around the world.
Thanks, Nick. That was very rallying. So I'm going to take that as your closing remark and just give Ruth a chance to give a closing remark and maybe do her own plugs as well.
I'm not sure how I follow that. We did promote the event to our supporters, so if there's any Transform Trade supporters out there, we will be building on the hand raiser and looking at what else we can do. Obviously, the Fashion Watchdog will still be at the top of our list. We'll be doing lots more on that. And it is 24th of April is the anniversary of the Rana Plaza collapse. So look out for stuff coming from us then. 1st of May, International Workers' Day. We think there's more. And as it happens, the Department for Business and Trade has its trade questions in Parliament on that day. So we're hoping there'll be lots of MPs ready to ask questions about workers and international supply chains on that day. I don't think I have any very inspiring last words, except to say I agree with Nick. I think we could stop a US trade deal. It will be toxic, and there will be obvious ways that we'll be able to show how toxic it is. I think then, you know, there's this broader question of how do we create that momentum and movement towards a different way of doing things. And I think that's something that I'm hoping our organisations and our supporters will work together on. Thanks.
That was very rallying. Love that. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Ruth and Nick. And thanks, everyone, for joining and your very insightful questions. I think it's clear there's loads of knowledge in our movement, and we have history on defeating these things, so we can do it again. We'll send out the slides and a recording and some of the useful links. So hopefully you should have everything you need. But otherwise, I'll close that there. Thank you very much, everyone.